Appreciate you. Thank you. I
That wasn't me.
appreciate you asking me to do this. It's difficult to know what to talk with an up-to-date and knowledgeable audience, what to talk about. My first thought was to dig out something on Tennyson and Lincolnshire, which I had promised myself I would work on in retirement, and I'd been working on. My mother lived in Grimsby well into her 90s, so it was convenient to do research in Lincoln and Louth and visit her. In the Goulding collection in Lincoln, particularly. Once I moved to the library, I had to do a lot of different things. And I'd pretty much given up teaching Victorian by then anyway. But I did a Tennyson exhibit in 1992 for the centenary, and I did a Tennyson exhibit in 2009 for the bicentenary. And between that, there were various acquisitions. I did think I wanted to do something to do with collections at the library that had come in my time, and I thought of writing about this letter, which is a remarkable letter, really. Tennyson was telling someone that a young poet who had just published his first book should get a real job and get on with life before he turned to poetry, which I think is a bit rich coming from Tennyson, but still, he said it was based on his own experience that he should do that. Remarkably, soon after he wrote this letter, the young poet was working, had been taken up by Lady Byron and was working on an estate and got involved with one of the Byron girls and got into a fight with a relative and was thrown off the estate. And this would have been in 1852, 53. And also remarkably, he then went on, immigrated to America, was involved with John Brown and all sorts of things, but was in the Civil War and wrote his best poetry as a war poet. It seems an odd anticipation of Maud, and perhaps the genesis of Maud, the precipitating factor, was Richard Rolfe in making Tennyson turn back to the theme of the highborn lady and all that, rather than just turn back to his own experience in the 30s. But I thought instead, Valerie said that would go too far astray, and she was right. I thought instead that I would talk about a book, and this is John Herschel's Preliminary Discourse on the Study of Natural Philosophy, which it's a remarkable book. It's the theme of Tennyson and science will come in incidentally, but the talk is about this book because I'm better talking about something I know. It's an odd item because people recurrently talk about Tennyson knowing Herschel and being influenced by Herschel, and it was a very important book in its time. But there's no reference to it in his letters. There's no ironclad allusion to it in his poems. Of course, it isn't in Lincoln if it's in South Carolina, so it's not in the list of his books. And so there's questions. Moreover, this copy, which is meant to be Tennyson's, and I think it probably is, was not known. There's no provenance of it for 80 years before 1924, and there's no record of where it was, no location for 80 years afterwards. And normally that raises all sorts of questions, which we will consider in a short time. In 2007, on April the 12th, I was sitting at my computer and saw this record on ABE. And I did check it a bit before I leapt to the phone, but I put the book on hold. It's said to be Tennyson's copy, signed by him, which had been referred to but was lost since 1924. A wonderful association copy, says the bookseller. I see that on Monday, I put it on hold for the weekend, checked the budget, and I see that on Monday we said that we got the money and we checked a little bit further. And then on by Tuesday of the following week, it was recently processed with a little bit of extra detail. You never buy books for a library unless you've got some collection to go with them, or at least that was the old recommendation. It fitted in with several collections, not just with my vanity of wanting stuff on Tennyson, but we had big science collections from the 1820s, and we'd been given a Darwin collection about the time I moved to the library, and we were given an astronomy collection, which we were already negotiating for when we bought that book. We were given an astronomy collection in 2011, and they've both been quite useful in the past weeks looking at this book. The Herschels, of course, are well known, but people muddle together which Herschel they're talking about. This Herschel is the son, but his father was the famous one, and his aunt is the one who's coming into focus for a number of studies now. But the father had this huge telescope, first a 20-foot and then a 40-foot telescope, which he made himself. He made lots of telescopes himself. And he was the discoverer of Venus and the charter of the double stars and the charter of nebulae and so on. So he was a famous man. And any Victorian would have known about him. If you actually look at Tennyson's early poems about references to stars and so on, they don't require you to have read technical astronomy stuff. You could pick it up in the buzz if you wanted to. There are, in fact, in some cancel lines from the Palace of Art, there are references to double stars and the miraculous round of milky light and all this kind of stuff that are influenced by the way Laplace and the older Herschel were writing about astronomy. If you look at Tennyson's library, you find that the books don't support the idea that he'd built a big library, unless he'd chucked a lot of books out, given them away. He really was dependent a bit on the books in his father's library, though those are the ones which survived over. The most important early book that he's known to have got himself is Mary Somerville's Connection of the Physical Sciences, which he got at Christmas 1838. It was the fourth edition. And I haven't looked for Nichol's view of the architecture of the heavens, but most of the books which are about astronomy in his library, Jack Meadows, who I knew at Leicester, says were acquired during the last 30 years of his life. In the last 30 years of his life is when he becomes famous as the poet of science. And he knew Herschel, John Herschel, who by then had sort of retired. I mean, he was still doing his catalogs and things, and he was still a big figure. And the two of them would swap thoughts about the mystery of the universe and so forth. And you get them. Herschel had been a pioneer in astronomy, in photography. He was a chemist, amongst many other things. And he invented one of the photographic processes in 1838. And Julia Margaret Cameron knew them both on the Isle of Wight and took photographs of them. But it's quite different from the young Tennyson, who one thinks of as having written in this book in 1843. And what he says about astronomy, the astronomy and geology, the terrible muses, the sun, planets and the dust of the vanished race, and cosmos chaos, the ancient sage view of astronomy and cosmology is really not the way people were talking when he was young. I only got Holmes's new book isn't out yet over here. I got a copy and I bombed through it. I can't say that I've absorbed the whole of its picture, but it's quite clear that Tennyson was very interested and wrote about astronomy a lot when he was young, but he wasn't really buying books about it. Um, it's in the later part of a lot of the discussion of Tennyson and science comes from the people who were groupies in the late part of his period. It's what John Holmes has been writing about, um, that the scientists wanted Tennyson as the poet of science, really, more than he was interested in science, I think. He was socialized with them a lot. But Huxley and Sidgwick, and there are plenty of famous quotes about how famous he was. And because Norman Lockyer was an astronomer, uh, Norman Lockyer's book was really the main book on Tennyson as poet of science for a long time. It gives a huge amount of its space to Tennyson's references to astronomy. But it seemed a natural thing to do. You do Tennyson's attitude to music, Tennyson's, you get Stanford to do that, you get the Bishop of Ripon to say Tennyson and religion, and then you get Norman Lockyer and Oliver Lodge to do about his attitudes to science. It was just part of the public image of him in later life. When I was in the 60s, though, it didn't seem astronomy was that central. There was Jack Meadows at Leicester who did the book called The High Firmament about astronomy and poetry, who was part of the Victorian Studies group there. But most of what we did was dominated by the recent Darwin centenary, by Millhouse's book. The press republished Vestiges of Creation, which I see I've put backwards as a picture. And there was this very influential article on Tennyson, Lyell, and Darwin by Wallace Gibson about the different kinds of discourse in Victorian studies. You look in the notes to Ricks doesn't say, I'm going to look in Herschel for parallel passages. The footnotes give the more important of the sources and analogues from Lyell's Principles of Geology and Chambers' Vestiges of Creation. And if I'm honest, when you have 75 minutes to do in memoriam in a class, or even longer, you're likely to do 54, 55, 56 and do evolution. And then you're likely to do 123 and the hills are shadows and Lyell, and then skip on lightly to all the other topics you have to cover. There's a lot of really good scholarship on all aspects of Tennyson and science, but I think it's fair to say in terms of public awareness and interest, certainly in Britain, astronomy was not as big a concern in the poems as it might have been in America during the space race. There's good scholarship on Tennyson's, or certainly repeated references to Herschel's preliminary discourse in Tennyson studies. I did share about this book with Greg Tate before he did his book. He was in the process of doing it when I put it in the bulletin that we had it. And he was very tactful. He didn't preempt me working on it, but he did refer to it. So he's the only scholar who knew where it was. The thing is that people had been referring to this book for years, but they had not ever seen it. If you look at the top at Anne Henchman, she is citing Mattis, and it's then saying, well, of course, he knew about these things anyway, through other directions. If you look in Millhauser, who had a very good article on magnetic mockeries in the phrase magnetic mockeries in ELN, and he just says, we are, in natural philosophy, we're confident he knew. And then he footnotes Mattis. And then you look in Mattis, which says, he seems to have come into possession in 1843. So she's referring to this book. But when you look down at the footnote, what she's referring to is the auction catalogue from 1924. She hadn't ever seen it. No one had seen it. They were simply going on Matty's report on the auction catalogue when they refer to it. So there is the auction report, which tells you it's his with his autograph on the flyleaf, and it doesn't really, there's a number of scorings, particularly by Tennyson. There are various oddities about this. One of them is that it says that it's 1830, and the book came out in 1831. But that's because it's the engraved title page. It doesn't tell you that that the real title page is missing, right? But you do find out which the gallery was, which the thing. Anyway, when it came, here it was in a box, and it was stained as given, turned up, within a few days. And there is the inscription, and there are the scorings. So we can bet that this is the copy that was sold in 1924. It's not a different copy, right? We're only talking about one book. However, when you get it and look at it, the cloth is wrong. Of course, that isn't a book from 1830, is it? Or 31, it's not a first edition, right? I don't know what Bill Baker would think it was, but we opened it and we said it's late 1830s, early 1840s. And we thought to ourselves, should we send it back as misdescribed? And we thought to ourselves, no, it's an interesting book, right? We will keep it. I got a discount and it wasn't expensive anyway. Which brings us to John Carter's great statement, right? In 1932, the attitude of mind most desirable in a bibliographer is suspicion, which is what we need to think about. It's wonderful. I mean, he is the man who wrote the Inquiry. It became famous later. Okay, here is really the same site again, but the sale was a sale at Anderson Galleries, and it was being boosted in the New York Times. And as nearly always in the 1920s, the top bid came in from Rosenbach, even if he wasn't going to pay for the book for 2 years and hope he could sell it to someone else first. But it's a headline grabbing sale, right? From the Anderson Galleries, Mitchell Kennelly, president. Well, the auction house gives you pause for thought, a little bit of pause for thought. Mitchell Kennelly, I've put the flattering picture at the top, and Matt has a variety of pictures on his biography at the bottom. My colleague, Matt Bruckley, much admired Mitchell Kennelly, right? Who is somewhere on the spectrum between an enthusiast and a rogue, right? And it came out differently in different bits of his life. He was a protege of Arnold Bennett. He was the office boy at the Bodley Head. John Lane took him over to New York in 1896 to run his office. He was a publisher. He published 400 books as a publisher under the imprint Mitchell Kennelly. But around about 1915 or so, he got involved with the Anderson Galleries and American Art Association. They were separate, they came together, they separated, and so on. It's a complicated picture. Eventually, the two people he fired, Park and Burnett, took it over, and it became part of Sotheby's. But these were the two dominant New York auction houses at the time. He did some amazing sales, right? He did the sale of H. Buxton Forman, who you may remember from John Carter's work. He did the Quinn sale, he did Jerome Cairns' sale in 1929. And in fact, I mean, it's the sort of gallery that had the highest, the Jerome Cairns sale was one of the highest earning sales of the 1920s, just on the brink of the crash. Kennelly had taken his commissions on the sales before the crash, but the gallery had difficulties because people wouldn't pay up afterwards. He sold two Gutenberg Bibles, right, as an auctioneer. I mean, he didn't do the auctioneering himself, he did the promotion, but he was a really significant figure, but really on the edges of things. Went bankrupt in the 50s and depressed and committed suicide. The collector is a rather similar figure, but wholly American. He was running, I think, a wholesale book business of some kind as his job, but he started collecting books and joined the Grolier Club. He really only started collecting in the early 1890s. He picked up an item in 1894 or 5 that he thought was a unique proof copy of the Idols, and he corresponded with Wise about it, and he loaned it to Wise, and Wise wrote it up, and they went on interacting after that. And he had quite a number of Wise forgeries in his collections. He wrote a book in 1898, First Report of a Book Collector, in which he reports, so little are these rare Tennyson books known that until 1896, none of them has ever been mentioned in any bibliography or catalogue. Well, you know, red flags all over the place, right? He sold significant collections in 1901. He's, as far as I know, the only person who puts out a catalogue for an auction and then puts it out again afterwards with the prices in and a statement of what he'd paid for things. He doesn't always tell you who he got the things from. But that sale in 1901 included a number of Wise forgeries, including allegedly the copy of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Sonnets Reading 1850, which Miss Mitford gave to Charles Kingsley. Believe it if you like, but it's the most famous of the Wise forgeries. And Arnold's copies then get cited in Wise's bibliography as evidence for the printing history of Wise. It's one of the scandals of Tennyson scholarship that Wise has never been replaced. You know, you can't have a bibliography that's 95% accurate because unless you know which the 5% is that's wrong. When it wasn't old, but when he thought he was getting old and might have been sick, he set up his own estate sale. Arnold set up his own estate sale. First of all, he wrote a book about his collecting, which includes a chapter, My Tennysons, which is well worth reading. And it came out from Scribner's in 1923, and it had a foreword by Thomas J. Wise about how he'd got to know it actually came out posthumously, though just posthumously. But he talks about their exchanges and how he'd managed to help Arnold collect things. I mean, it's one of these wonderful things where there's a sort of teasing of people in the know about this. It's all before Wise was exposed, but he talks about being loaned books by Arnold that were new things for him. And then after that, the next year, there was the sale, the most important book sale of the season so far, right? And for that, he also had an introduction. And the introduction then was by R.B. Adam, Robert Borthwick Adam of Buffalo, who says, this is what you should do when you get old. You should sell your books so that other people can enjoy collecting. And Adam was as straight as they come. He was the adopted son of a furniture business in Buffalo. And his adoptive father had collected Burns, and he had one of the great Burns collections, which is how I know about him. He wasn't alert to the book world in the 1920s has an inner circle of people like Arnold and Rosenbach and Kennelly, and an outer circle of people with big money who are collecting. And Adam was the outer circle, really. And was taken for a ride by other people. I mean, he had things he'd bought as Burns manuscripts, which when he tried to sell them to Dr. Rosenbach, Dr. Rosenbach said, no, that's a forgery, right? And in that case, it was. I know of cases where things were sold at Kenley's in the Kern sale in the 1920s as genuine, was subsequently, when people tried to resell them, labeled forgeries, bought relatively cheaply. When you look at them now, I can prove that they're not forgeries. So it was a difficult world, and Adam was, in a sense, an unimpeachable innocent in this. And he wrote the endorsement for William Harris Arnold. So we have lots of red flags about this book before we even look inside it. These are the three catalogue records, very sparse one by Arnold in his own estate sale, I think, except I think that the bit which says presumably by Tennyson, presumably, I think that will be the auction house covering themselves against returns, as misdescribed. That's the bookseller, who is much more fulsome. And then this is the first holding one recently processed from our catalogue, which says what the where the scorings come, which pages they come on, and which also has other details about it. When you open the book, that's just as described. There is this provenance inscription here. There's nothing you can tell about it except that there's a crack in the hinges there. But when you look in the back end paper is missing. You will also find there's no half title, or there's only the engraved title page. And the engraved title page does read 1830 in a first edition, but you'll notice up here it says new edition on the title page, although it says 1830. But there's no typographic title page, and there's no half title, which there should be. I looked this morning, they were not conjugate leaves. They were part of a 4-page first gathering, which had the engraved title page typically tipped in the middle of it. So the first thing you do is you look for comparable copies, which wasn't that difficult because it was an important enough item that South Carolina College had bought it by 1835, bought a set of Lardner's Encyclopedia, put it in its own bindings, which messes up what you can know about it. But we also had two firsts, one of which was not rebound. It was in this cloth with the paper label and with the additional type bit on at the bottom. But that we didn't put that on. Hang on. Lardner's Encyclopedia, the series in which it came, has been the subject of quite a lot of bibliographical as well as interpretative history of science discussion. The best study, I think, is the one by Morse Peckham done in PBSA years ago, my late colleague at South Carolina. The most interesting account is the one by Hayes in the Annals of Science, which is a rollicking good read about Lardner as entrepreneur and rogue. But famous people were contributing to it. The first volumes to appear were by Walter Scott's History of Scotland, which he needed the money, so he did it quick. Herschel's was theoretically the lead volume of a series on to introduce the science series of the encyclopedia, but was sold separately. And James Secor, who also wrote the book about vestiges of creation, has a chapter on it in his book Visions of Science. So it's not an unknown thing. This is the original binding, famously glazed cloth. That's Thackeray in Fraser's magazine in yellow plush papers saying, cheap as dirt. It's one of the literary wonders of the world. Cheap as dirt, bound in glazed calico, 6 shillings a volume, the illustrious names of Walter Scott, Thomas More, Dr. Southey, James Mackintosh, Dr. Donovan, and myself are to be found in the list of contributors, right, filled with the pure lambent flame of science. But that's, one's first reaction to the cloth was right, wasn't it? There were in the first edition a series of title pages, 3 title pages. If you get a normal copy of the book, you will get the front 3 end paper. You will then get non-integral ads from Longmans and for the encyclopedia. You may get a little insert as well. You then get the half title with quotes on the verso. You then get the first of the title pages, which is a typographic title page dated 1831. It was actually published in February 1831, although the engraved title page, which must have been prepared earlier, says 1830. If you go to the end of the book, you then find after the index, there is a separate extra title page in case you were only buying the science volumes, and you could have those bound up as a series. It's often discarded. And then there were non-integral ads, and then there was a rear end paper. Now, quite a lot of these bits are missing. The Arial copy has the ads, the Irving copy has the ads, the Arial copy, which was rebound, doesn't, but it has all the other bits. The title page of the new edition in 1835, which is one of the South Carolina copies, college copies, says the date, 1835, a new edition 1835. And the same plates will have been used for quite a bit after that. There were lots of reprintings. We don't know that Tennyson's copy was 1835, but we do know that it wasn't 1831 because of the engraved title page. But in fact, the engraved title page, although it kept the date 1830 at the bottom, had new edition added on the engraved title page. Don't know why. South Carolina copies, college copies are rebound always in that college binding with the name on the front. But it's impossible to know. You wouldn't rebind it with the ads in, non-integral ads. You discard those, but very probably the series half title would have been there and been discarded at that point. Which brings us to, it's a genuine, if slightly mangled and damaged, copy of Herschel, probably after 1835, and so it could have been one which Tennyson read. The mangling doesn't affect whether it's Tennyson's or not, but the mangling does give you lots of pause for thought. The obvious reason for dumping a half title or a title is that it had some inscription on which conflicts with the provenance you want to attribute. Or perhaps it had the date 1830 something on and they wanted it to be a first edition, or it just got damaged. I don't know. People were faking Tennyson in the 1890s. This is a nice example. If you know, currently for sale, there is a copy of this letter for sale, the letter of the 2 on the left of the screen, currently from Richard Ford, who's a respectable British dealer, as a forgery. There is the same letter reproduced in Strand magazine as a facsimile in 1894. We don't know whether that's the original or not, but it says that it's in the possession of Messrs. Noel Conway of Birmingham. But you then turn and you find that this is a letter of which there are copies in 3 or 4 different major libraries. The Senate House in London, I've got a list somewhere which I'll give you. I'm not reading my talk, but let me give it to you for a second. Because it's sort of instructive. Cecil Lang picks it out as one of the one of the important forgeries or interesting forgeries. It is, he says, the most common, if not the most interesting of all Tennyson letters. There are identical holographs with identical provenance inscriptions in multiple libraries, and he lists them, and I haven't listed them here. But surprisingly, he chooses the Strand magazine one as his copy text as being better than any of the other ones. It isn't that different from a genuine letter, which is also currently for sale. When you get to inscriptions, in the front of books, they're even more easier to forge and more difficult to authenticate. I just put this up so that you'd see that people were reproducing such things all around the place throughout the 1890s and early 20s. I think it's genuine, and my reason for thinking that it's genuine is the information. 2 MCBs, 2 Mitre Court buildings in the Temple, which was the home of the chambers of Tennyson's friends, Venables and Lushington. And Tennyson was there in London in the fall of 1843. You couldn't deduce this from the memoir or other early sources. You can only get it once the letters are out from Shannon and Lang. And so my instinct is that nobody else could have forged it because a forger wouldn't know to put those details in. So it's really external evidence rather than handwriting recognition for that one. But I think it does prove it is likely to be authentic, that inscription. When we come to the provenance inscription on the introduction, we're in much worse shape. This must have been written after 1896. Mrs. Brotherton lived till 1910. If this came from her books, she could have been selling it, but also it could have been dispersed afterwards. But it could also have been faked, right? Later, in 1907, I think it is, a copy of her first book from 1850, which was being reprinted, has an inscription in the front which says Mrs. B was a personal friend of the late laureate, Alfred Lord Tennyson. Now, somebody knew that about her. I have a colleague, a former student, who in retirement has digitized a great number of spiritualist magazines. And everybody in the late 19th century, as far as I can see, gets implicated in spiritualism, either directly or because the spiritualists want to claim them in some way. And Mrs. Brotherton was an ardent spiritualist, as was, and Tennyson gets implicated with them in some ways. So and she was on the Isle of Wight, and there are books she gave, which are in Lincoln, inscribed books to them, and there are books which have been for sale that Tennyson inscribed for her. So it's possible that she got a book from the collection at Farringford. But if we validated the inscription, the ownership inscription, the provenance between then and Arnold doesn't really matter. It's not crucial. It'd be nice to sort it out. Which brings us to the marginal markings, which are the most easy thing you could think of to fake, in a way. They're quite interesting. There's more of them than people thought, I think. And they tend to be the straight strikes against long passages. And it is a bit of a problem how to make sure that this how to convey where the marking is and still have enough of the passage to make sense. But they are on a particular theme, which is how the study of astronomy or the study of science more generally contributes to the development of society, the progress of thought. So it's really the outcome, and Herschel was very much a gradualist. He was against revolution and so forth, and he stresses time and again the importance of science for restraining society, but also giving it progress. So, it doesn't match exactly with Tennyson at that phase of his life, I think. Maybe it does. Here's another one, right, where the progress of science will mean that we are no longer passive victims of history, right? We are no longer supinely and helplessly carried down the stream of events, but feel ourselves capable of buffeting at least with its waves, perhaps of riding triumphantly over them. The reason which has enabled us to subdue all nature to our purposes should, if permitted and assisted by the providence of God, achieve a far more difficult conquest, a means of enabling the collective wisdom of mankind to bear down upon these obstacles which individual short-sightedness, selfishness, and passion oppose to all improvements, and by which the highest hopes are continually blighted and the fairest prospects marred. So that's to do with science and the future. He does have some references to astronomy in it. And I was looking for where Tennyson says that Venus is horned like the moon, and I couldn't find it. But they're relatively minor. Then I don't think anyone has picked them out as annotating particular bits of Tennyson's poetry. And the conclusion here, this among many such lessons will teach us the most important use of natural things, natural objects. Science will not just increase the physical resources of mankind, but will provide continual accessions to our power of penetrating into the arcana of nature. Now, that idea of the prophetic sort of imaginative insight, which really doesn't fit very well with the stress on inductive science in Herschel, is the sort of thing that would appeal to Tennyson, but has not been picked out by the people who've commented. That Matters is the only person who risks trying to discuss particular passages from the book. And she hits 1 out of 3. She has 3 passages which she discusses. Which brings me to my conclusion, which I'm actually going to read so that I do it carefully. Where does this leave us? I've tried to be, if not nastily suspicious, at least cautious in describing the issues raised by this copy. Any inscribed book that passed through Kennelly's auction house and the collection of one of T.J. Wise's customers must be treated skeptically, especially a copy with no real documentation on its whereabouts between the 1840s and the 1920s and between the 1920s and the early 2000s. I'm still not sure we ought to trust the Brotherton provenance. Neither Tennyson's letters nor the letters and journals of Emily Tennyson refer to him owning a copy. The binding and misdating and missing leaves initially unsettled me. That said, relabeling the copy as a late 1830s, 1840s reprinting, not an 1830 first edition, hardly undercuts Tennyson reading it in 1843. The ownership inscription is more than plausible, but the clincher is that the date fit Tennyson's known movements in a way no forger could get right. So I'm fairly confident this was indeed a copy that Tennyson inscribed and read. On the markings, reasonable people might differ. No handwriting expert can help much with markings like that. They do show the kind of reading Tennyson often did, marking bits for further thought, rather than commenting or marking the steps of an argument. The thing that inclines me to believe they're authentic is the unexpectedness of the passages that are marked. Whether or not you're convinced, rescuing the book from limbo after 80 plus years of it being unlocated at least allows the evidence about it. The book, which has been much discussed but never seen, allows the evidence about it to be laid on the table and clears up a long-standing irritant for Tennyson researchers. Thank you.